Good day. We're coming to you again from the spring meeting of the American Bankruptcy Institute. I am ABI's editor-at-large, Bill Rochelle. Sitting with me is my good friend Corinne Ball, the head of the Global Distressed Investing Group from Jones Day, and she is resident in Jones Day's New York office when she's in New York, which I imagine is probably
not that much
precious
lately.
few days out of the year. Corinne, in the upper echelons of the distressed investing community these days, a really hot topic is liability management. Exactly what is it, and why do we care, and why do they care?
Liability management is probably the single most important sophisticated buzzword for anyone really doing borrower or company side, otherwise known as debtor. But the flip side of using liability management is to do everything you can to avoid being a debtor. It's a term that's used to talk about exchange offers, looking at a balance sheet and reconstructing it to do three things: get more cash, get more time, and get some operating flexibility, waiver of covenants, so you can do what you need to do, sell assets, whatever.
Gee, that sounds an awful lot like Caesar's.
I would say liability management was one of the exercises that led Caesars into all the litigation that it's now experiencing, to the point where a guarantee was released as part of the program of refinancing and raising money. It's not the only one. EFH with Texas, the single largest Chapter 11.
Energy futures.
Energy future holdings. Energy future holdings went balance sheet upside down, probably 2011. And to gain time, rather than file, they did exchange offers, they did reconstructed revolvers, and they gained themselves probably 3 to 4 years of runway.
Now, what are the good sides and the downsides of vigorous liability management?
Vigorous liability management, you're usually working with publicly issued debt. Very often, high yield debt. Very often, people who really won't respond if you're construing their contracts. So it's an exercise that's really focused on what the documents permit me to do to not have all my assets behind this bond issue. I need flexibility to get some of my assets to go to work, to raise cash for other businesses, to issue new debt. So I have to be very clever, or at least very concise, in looking at the contracts to say just what can I do with unrestricted subsidiaries, investment baskets, incremental borrowing. All terms that are associated with liability management, which really helps manage the balance sheet to keep the current owners and management in place.
Interesting concept, to keep current management and owners in place. Now, if you look at the Caesars case, they effectively did keep themselves out of Chapter 11 for a while, but it has saddled the company with enormous litigation. Is that really a good result?
Well, I can't comment too much on that one. As you know, my firm is involved in that one, but I leave it to you. There now is an examiner's report.
Certainly is.
Certainly
Very
is
long
by
one.
our former colleague, Mr. Davis, and I think he's reached conclusions. It's not that liability management is wrong. I think he would say it's how you did it, who did it, and what was the end result. And when you take it all together, was it fair? I think it's being litigated in other places. I think it's happening around the world. It's not just big U.S. high yield. But what are you going to do when these LBOs and private equity deals are done, when leverage was 9, 10 times? Now, with guidance from the regulators, banks can't do more than 6 is the absolute limit, 6 times EBITDA. What we're really seeing is what they're really doing is more like 3 times, because they have to allow for flex, pricing flex, baskets, incremental debt. So we're watching the face of financing change as well as a consequence of this.
Well, let me ask you this. Chapter 11 reorganization in this country is very highly developed, obviously more so than anywhere else in the world. So why do companies go through these difficult, as you call them, liability management exercises when they could have filed Chapter 11 earlier? Why not go the Chapter 11 route sooner?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think most believe that if they were to go, and you'll look at EFH. Remember I said the balance sheet was upside down, meaning book liabilities exceeded assets. Equity would be frozen out. And if you think about a commodity-driven business, which is probably the most obvious one, if you're thinking it's cyclical and all I need to do is get running room to survive the cycle, we'll be fine. So if you are ever the optimist that this low price in commodities, and think about EFH, gas was at that time they thought artificially low and it would come back and then everybody be back in the money, and they were just trying to gain time to go through business cycle. That was kind of the origin of a lot of this, was to survive the volatility in earnings. But now I think it's gone into telecom, radio, it's kind of gone beyond commodities, which is where it originally started.
Well, regardless of whether liability management is a good or a bad thing, it has led to a great deal of litigation in our larger cases and even some smaller ones. Now,
sure, we have a thing called the Trust Indenture Act. It's not clear you can do a lot of this.
Now, is this degree of litigation that we see right now, and in the uncertainty that it breeds, good for the bankruptcy process in the U.S. or not? And what effect is it having on bankruptcy?
Near term, I think it's creating an immense expense that is only fueling more liability management to avoid Chapter 11 and fueling, is there an alternative? If you think right now that commodities are probably the most suffering, natural resource commodities, the most suffering sector, Canada, what is it, 70% of its GDP is natural resources. Those companies historically would have done parallel proceedings, Chapter 11, because most of their debt is U.S., some of their assets are U.S., and a Canadian CCAA. I think what's happened with all of this expense is that we're going to see, instead of a Chapter 11, we're going to start seeing Chapter 15 perhaps on steroids.
What do you mean by that?
Well, looking for relief. Remember the way Chapter 15 is set up, it's only supposed to be a procedure to recognize an order entered in another jurisdiction. Whether or not you can reject leases, whether or not you can sell assets, whether or not you can bring lawsuits, are all discretionary in Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is just supposed to recognize the pre-existing order and is discretionary as to whether you want it to do more. Well, think about, we're going to start seeing a lot of Chapter 15s that reject licenses, that reject leases, contracts, asset sales, and bind all the bondholders in the U.S. Class vote, Canada, you're done. Oh, you weren't up there? You didn't really get it? So I think we're going to see, instead of the protections of Chapter 11 for a lot of our debt holders, we're going to see Chapter 15 on steroids and much different systems being in the first instance. Almost as if our taking Chapter 11 the extreme has kind of left people very anxious about going down that road and incurring the expense.
Yeah. We'll tell you what, briefly, before we end, what about offshore companies, developing nations that have incurred enormous amounts of high-yield debt in the last few years? Where is that headed?
It's very interesting you should raise that, because that one is exceedingly complex, and the waters are just, the concepts are just developing. Emerging markets probably have 14 trillion. We know the World Bank's told us they're going to be record levels of default. The IMF has said the local banks in the emerging markets are going to go into a liquidity crunch. There won't be any money available there. And when you put that together with the S&P saying, and none of it's really going to be refinanceable through high yield, it's creating a problem of monstrous proportions that we're going to have to deal with. But so we would have a tax-efficient jurisdiction for the issuer, BVI, Bahamas, the Caymans, Mauritius, Cyprus. That's where the entity is organized, and that's the entity that issues all these bonds. And these bonds are English law, euro-denominated, New York law, dollar-denominated, and then all the money goes to wherever the emerging market operating enterprise is. So it wouldn't be unusual to have a BVI company listed on the Hong Kong Exchange, raising immense amounts of money in corporate bond debt and shipping the money to an operation in mainland China, Malaysia, Indonesia. So what's going to happen when these businesses need more capital? They're going to need it. They're facing a default. Who's going to put more money into these businesses unless the defaults are reconciled in some way? So I think we're going to have to come up, and I have all faith in those of us who do Chapter 11, of a way to solve this problem, cure the defaults and put new money in. And I also have to say thank goodness for the alternative capital providers, because as we're witnessing the regulatory environment for banks worldwide really limiting what they can do, this gap is being filled by some incredibly creative people.
Wow. Corinne, thank you. You have told us, in effect, that the next recession is going to be a doozy. And the creativity to come out of the bar in the U.S. and Wall Street to deal with offshore debt is going to be a thrill to watch.
It will be. It won't be Wall Street in terms of bulge bracket banks anymore. It's going to be these alternative capital providers. Maybe they're in Greenwich, Fort Worth, L.A. You tell me, but
well, it's going to be great fun.
I think
Corinne,
it will be fun.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Bill.